Let's dive right into the book of John this morning. If you're not already there, go ahead and go to John chapter 9. And we've been considering in John chapter 9 is Jesus's John's sixth hand-selected miracle or sign designed to convince his readers to put their faith in Jesus Christ alone. And the sign that we look at in John chapter 9 was an undeniable divine miracle. We're going to kind of get the flavor of that this morning a little bit, so I won't spend a lot of time. But it was undeniable because what Jesus does in John chapter 9 is he heals a man who was born blind of blindness. Now, sometimes when you see Jesus, you're just not shocked by anything that he's done. But to put in perspective, this had never happened before in the history of the world before or since. So this is an incredible miracle designed to, again, convince people that Jesus was who he said he was. Now, the problem, if there is a problem, at least to the religious leaders, is that he did it on a Sabbath day. That put them in a bundle. As my mom used to say, don't get your underwear in a bundle, right? These guys had their underwear in a bundle over this Sabbath day healing because they couldn't quite figure out how something clearly divine could happen and yet be done on the wrong day. That was kind of their thinking. And so they were actually given the responsibility. This was kind of Jewish culture. They were given the responsibility to sort through this. And so last week we started to see their first kind of round of legal investigation, legal interrogation, trying to get to the bottom of this miracle, how it happened, who did it, when did it happen, these kind of things, asking the question. This morning, we're going to see a familiar witness get brought back to the witness stand. It's the blind man himself. And so they're going to bring him back in verse 24. Let's go ahead and read this. So they again called the man who was blind and said to him, "Give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner." And so remember, they had already called him. They didn't believe him. This is what we learned last week. They had already called him and interviewed him. They just didn't believe him. The parents have now been brought in. They've confirmed his identity. We saw that last week. And now they just don't want him giving any credit to Jesus, okay? It's interesting. They can't figure this out, but now they're going into damage control mode. They're trying to control the messaging coming out of this man going forward. They're going into PR mode, okay? It's like they've hired a PR specialist. Say, now we gotta control the messaging that this guy's gonna give out to other people. And this is what they did, because if you remember the last interview they had with the man was kind of leaning toward, he was still safely communicating, but he was kind of leaning toward Jesus being a little special. Remember he said, I don't know, I think he's a prophet. Right? So he's kind of leaning toward a positive view of Jesus. So they're coming back trying to control this messaging, and they give him a command. They say basically, give God glory in this moment, which by the way was the designed outcome of the miracle. That's what God wanted to do. He wanted to receive glory for this. He wanted his son to receive glory from this. And the problem with the religious leaders is they viewed those two things as mutually exclusive. You can't give God glory and Jesus glory, because Jesus is a sinner and God is not. That was kind of their mindset here. And so this is what they're trying to control. And when we remember that word glory, it simply means thought or opinion, especially as it means human opinion in the realm of reputation. And so the Jewish religious leaders clearly thought if you gave Jesus glory or you enhanced his reputation through this miracle, then it would rob Yahweh of the glory that he so clearly deserved. Now, what's so interesting here is the religious leaders, and typically when the facts are not on your side and you talk more, you get exposed as the fraud that you are. And it's real subtle here, but can you tell what they just did that put themselves in a conundrum in verse 24? They just acknowledged that this was a divine miracle. That's what they did. They just acknowledged it. They said, you've got to give God the glory for the miracle. So they've just acknowledged it's a divine miracle. Now they've got a big problem because their interpretation of the Sabbath contradicts that. And not only that, but God apparently did this divine miracle using the human instrumentation of Jesus, who was a sinner. And they've got to put this equation together. And so they thought it this way. Man born blind, he was healed. That's a divine miracle. Give God the glory. But here's what they took out of the equation. And this is why they're tied up in knots like a pretzel. They took out the two middle components here. They believed that a man was born blind, he was healed. They did not want to acknowledge Jesus' involvement. And then guess what? They're not acknowledging that it was done on a Sabbath day either. So man born blind, God gets the credit, give God the glory, but you see the conundrum they've just put themselves in. Now they're ignoring two key facts that really has caused the issue in the first place. And this is what they say. We know that this man is a sinner. Speaking of Jesus Christ, this human instrument involved that you as the blind man say is involved here, he's a sinner. It can't work this way. And so they've put themselves, they back themselves in a corner because they don't want Jesus to get any credit. They realize it's a divine miracle, and you can see kind of the problem they're in. In fact, we know it means they know intuitively or instinctively. And the idea is they have already made up their minds about Jesus. The idea is we've known this. It's just easy to see it in this guy. It's kind of the idea. We've known this about this guy. He's just a dirty, rotten sinner. And so again, they've got a dilemma because if they're right, they're contradicting themselves because God then utilized a sinful person, a sinful agency to accomplish his will on a day that broke his Sabbath. You see, they're putting themselves in a really bad conundrum here, and they're reasoning from their prejudicial views. And remember, if you forget, go back to verse 16. There were two groups within the religious leaders that were arguing back and forth, but apparently the loudest and the most aggressive group won, which is the ones that want to reject Jesus. Remember back in verse 16, it said, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. That's the group that won out here. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. Unfortunately, the wrong group won out here, and they kind of took the lead in this investigation. Now, I'm going to just show you something here. It's very subtle, but we're going to see that this man begins to push back a little. And I would say in verse 25, it's still a little. But as you heard the scripture reading earlier, he eventually pushes back a lot. He kind of starts getting more aggressive. But notice what he says here in verse 24. He answered and said, whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. I think it's a very honest and safe answer that he gives here. He's like, I don't know. I'm not going to make a comment on that. All I know is this, I was blind, now I see. Again, not an outlandish statement. He's still staying below the radar. He's still showing respect for the Jewish religious leaders. And this is what he says, I don't know, meaning he doesn't have any instinctual or instinctive knowledge as to whether or not Jesus has broken the oral traditions of the law or that he's some kind of clandestine sinner that, stays up in Galilee and then behaves really well when he comes to Jerusalem. He's just saying, I don't know, I'm not gonna say, but why I think he's pushing back a little bit here is he could have just stayed below the radar entirely. Because what did they say in verse 24? They said, give God the glory. And guess how he could have avoided this whole rest of the conversation? I give God the glory. And then he could have gone home. But he doesn't do that. He's kind of, he's staying below the radar, but he's kind of pushing back a little bit. He could have just let it go. He could have just had it all over. And in fact, we do this sometimes. We do this in our life sometimes. We don't want to get into a conflict. And so we find the easiest way to agree with somebody without disagreeing with them, but without agreeing with them either, to just kind of get ourselves off the hot seat and leave. He doesn't do that here. He could have said, yep, give God the glory. Yahweh's awesome. All right, peace out. I'm out of here. I'm going to go home now, right? I'm going to keep my opinions of Jesus to myself. He doesn't say that. He kind of pushes just a little bit. So in some way, he's not shying away from them, but he's not taking them on directly either yet. Yet is the key phrase because he's about to take them on pretty clearly. The thing that he knows, the thing that he's confident is he was blind, now he sees. You think a blind man knows when they can see? Yeah, I think they know. He's super confident in that. But what is he also drawing attention to? And this is why I think he's pushing back a little bit again. He keeps putting the miracle in front of their face. He's like, I don't know this, but I do know this. And I do know that he healed me. And I do know that this is undeniable. Now, one of the things we're going to see as we go through, and we're going to kind of start seeing it here in the next couple of verses, is this man not only has received his physical sight, but he is starting to grow a spine. Through this process, he is going to start taking a stand, a backbone. He's going to have backbone against these guys. And he's going to start taking these guys on a little bit more aggressively because of the shenanigans that they're involved in. He's eventually just going to get so frustrated with these guys, he's going to say, do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth kind of deal? Because they didn't act like they were. So they keep drilling him over and over again. And this is what's going to push him too far. In verses 26 through 27, we read this. What did he do to you? They said to him again, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? By the way, has he answered that question a few times by now? Yeah, and so has other people. He answered them, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Now, he's okay so far, kind of. But this last phrase, do you also want to become his disciples? That's a sharp stick he just pulled out of his little cloak there. And so they're repeating it. They're interrogating him. They're going over and over and over again. Why did they ask it again? In fact, if you look at the account, you just kind of count down through. They've asked this question of all the parties involved at least 4 times by now, if not more. We may not have all of the accounts recorded, but at least 4 times we see that they've asked this exact question. Now, why do they ask it again? Well, think about it in the legal system. Why does any interrogator ask the same questions over and over and over again? What are they looking for? Well, we hope in police interrogation, we hope the reason they're doing it is they're trying to get to the truth, right? They're trying to understand what really happened because police people lie to them. That's their job. They get lied to every day. That's their job. They get lied to all the time, right? So you ask questions because when people explain things multiple times, they leave out a detail the first time. They bring up a detail the second time. They contradict themselves. The more they talk, the more rope they have to hang themselves, so to speak. And so I think this is what's going on here. They're asking questions. They're trying to get an answer, but I don't think they're trying to get to the truth. I don't think that's their idea. They're already prejudiced against Jesus. What they're looking for is a loophole to grab hold of, to discount Jesus. So they're actually not trying to do that. So they're just, bumping him. And finally, they've just bumped him enough. The guy's just had enough. And he's going to get a little feisty here with his answer. And I would venture to say that we can understand the guy's frustration. If you've ever been in a situation like this, where someone is just questioning you and questioning you and questioning you over and over and over again, you just, at some point, you're just like, enough, I've had enough. I had a friend one time and he was on the phone with his accountant, and his accountant is trying to do his taxes and the accountant just kept asking him questions. And he just finally, this guy's for him, right? Allegedly your accountant's kind of for you. They're trying to get you money back. But he was just like, I had enough. And I just hung up on him, and I hung up on his accountant, But anyways, we can see why he's getting a little frustrated. And so he answered and he said, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? And so he's seeing this firsthand, their prejudice. In fact, if you go back to verse 15, he's already answered the question. He's recounted the facts exactly as they happened. There's no more to say for him. And so the problem was now everyone's looking to the Jewish religious leaders. They have the facts, and they can't come to a conclusion. They can't come to a solution. So they just keep asking, again, hoping to find this loophole. Look at his frustration, these 3 leaders, or these three things that he says to the leaders. I told you already, you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? And so it's from his responses that he's going to just go next level here. And it gets more feisty as he goes. He doesn't understand what is wrong with these people. To him, and you can imagine this, it's hard to put yourself in somebody's mindset, but just think about what he's seeing and thinking. He went to bed the night before and he couldn't see anything, just like every other day of his life. And here we are less than 24 hours later and he sees. And he's having trouble understanding, why do the religious leaders, why are they so bent against this? Like, why are they so upset by this? Why aren't they excited about this like I am? So this is all these things going on. So he's just kind of frustrated. And then here's where he pulls out his little sharp stick. Do you also want to become his disciples? And I think this is a real dig at the religious leaders. Want, he uses this word here. It implies active volition and purpose. It means a strong desire or wish. And obviously they didn't, right? He knew that. He knew they didn't want to become Jesus' disciples. But by asking this question, he kind of in tongue in cheek said some things with some biting sarcasm. Number one, he implied that they want to know more about Jesus because they're trying to determine whether or not they want to follow him. And again, he knows this is the exact opposite. It kind of reminds me of, the dumb conversations you have in locker rooms in grade school. And you're you're kind of picking on somebody of the opposite gender. You're like, oh, they're so dumb, or they say the dumbest things, or they smell, or what, I mean, who knows, the mean things that we've all said. And then your friend says to you, oh, why are you talking about her so much? You must like her, And it's like this way of like shutting you down, and making you feel like, oh no, that's not what I meant at all. And this is what's going on here. He kind of he knows they don't like him, and he said, oh, do you want to be his disciple? You want to follow him? Is kind of the idea. Secondly, by implying they wanted to be his disciples, it implied that Jesus was a godly man, that they wanted to submit themselves under in order to learn from. This would have been very humiliating for the Jewish religious leaders who thought they were the top of the totem pole. Why would they put themselves under such a sinner like Jesus? And so, again, he knows what he's saying here. And by the way, using the present indicative, he's implying right now in this moment, they actively wanted to start following Jesus. So he's saying a lot here without saying too much. And you can see that he's losing his fear. The fear is leaving his body, so to speak, and he's getting a little bit more aggressive with them because he's getting more and more suspicious of their motives. Why won't they rejoice in this miracle? Why don't they see this as something positive? And so you do the same thing. When somebody is coming after somebody that's doing a good thing, your bells go off. The red flags go up in your mind. Like, why? I don't get this. Why are they so upset with this person? And so this is what's going on. And so instead of addressing the situation, because they didn't have any answers, what do? They go to personal insult mode. They go to attack mode. And they're going to get even more aggressive as we get into verse 34, okay? But this is kind of the tack that they're going to take here. We learn in verse 28, it says, then they reviled him. We're not exactly told what they said, but they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we don't know where he is from. Okay, reviled, it just means to speak in a highly insulting manner. So they came out with some doozies here. We don't have it recorded exactly what they said, but they were really coming out after this guy. And part of the reason was he had not assisted them in their narrative regarding Jesus. He just refused to assist them in finding a loophole to condemn Jesus. And it's always ironic, isn't it? And this is, especially as we come into the election season this year, right? And you'll see this all the time. It's always ironic when someone doesn't have the facts on their side, how they resort to an ad hominem attack. They go after the character. They start hurling insults. Nothing is new under the sun in that sense. So we're going to see that in the election cycle coming up. Just get used to it. But it wasn't new even 2,000 years ago. They do the same thing here. They begin to revile him, and they begin to say that this man is Jesus's disciple. This word are both phrases used in the present tense, meaning right now. They're saying, you are a disciple of Jesus. Right now, we are a disciple of Moses. We are not a disciple of this man, Jesus. And so the leaders were clearly irritated by this blind man's accusation about who they follow and who they submit themselves under. They would never submit themselves under Jesus Christ is kind of their point. Now, what's so interesting about this is they say that they're submitting themselves to Moses, that they're disciples of Moses. What are they specifically referencing? Well, in the context, again, they're the ones that are observing the Sabbath ordinance hardcore. See, that's where Jesus had gone wrong in their thinking. We're following Moses' interpretation, but again, as we've looked at, they weren't really following Moses' interpretation, were they? They were following the fences that they had established way further back as law that wasn't actually Moses' intent in recording the word of God. I love what Warren Wiersbe says about the Pharisees. He says the Pharisees were cautious men who would consider themselves conservatives when in reality they were preservatives. And the difference between a preservative and a conservative is a preservative simply embalms the past and preserves it. Their whole goal is to save the past at any cost against any change. They resist any kind of change in methodology. They resist any kind of change in anything that has never been done before. They try to preserve tradition. They're hung up on tradition. They're hung up on the way we've always done it, all these kind of things. And what's crazy, and it's true here of the Pharisees, and it's true of any legalist that exists in our day that's also could be described as a preservative. They are so hung up on methodology that they monkey with the message. They absolutely destroy the message at some point because they're so hung up on the way things have to happen that they lose the main thing. It's majoring on the minors, right? It's making a mountain out of a molehill, right? It's all those cliches that you can think of. This is exactly what they do. And so at some point, when you are a preservative, you major on the minors. You get everything backwards. You flip everything upside down from the way it's supposed to be. This is where they're at. This, as we're going to see later, and I hate to, blow the end here, but what we're going to see later is that when you talk about healing people that were blind, you know that there's only one season in the history of the world so far that was going to happen. It was during the Messianic age. This was a convincing miracle for religious men who should have known this from the scriptures, and they are right here in this moment rejecting it because they are so committed to their methodology and preserving what they've always had that they reject the main thing, and the main thing is Jesus Christ, Messiah, standing in front of them, and they just don't want it. So they go on to say, well, here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. We know that God spoke to Moses. We know that Moses recorded God's word. As for this fellow, speaking of Jesus, notice that respectful address. As for this dude over, this guy, this little joker over here, that's kind of the idea. We don't know where he's from. They don't know literally where his place is. That's kind of how you would maybe translate that literally. It just stresses the origin of his life. Where did he come from? What's the source of his miracles? What's the source of his healing? We don't know. And when the religious leaders say that, what are they implying by saying that? There's something off. There's something devious here. There's something nefarious here. We don't even know where this guy is from. So the implied idea is we can't trust him is the deal. And one of the things that you will see is failure to know where Jesus came from is going to be failing to know where he received his authority. Those two things go hand in hand. Moses came from God. Jesus' critics claimed, at least here, they claim they don't know whether he came from God or Satan. We don't know where he came from, which is ironic. I think it's a fascinating statement for many reasons. But one of the reasons it's so fascinating is they haven't had a problem before this telling everybody where he's from. In fact, they've told everybody up to this point many times that his origin and source of ministry is Satan himself. It's called the unpardonable sin. We've kind of been looking at that in John 8. But just a couple of examples, Matthew 9:34. But the Pharisee said he cast out demons, notice, by the agency or by the source or the power of the ruler of the demons. Well, who's the ruler of the demons? Satan, of course. That's Matthew 9:34. Matthew 12:24, which is where we usually go when we talk about the unpardonable sin, because that was kind of the breaking point, if you will. But it says, now when the Pharisees heard it, they said, this fellow does not cast out demons except by Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons, speaking of Satan. By the way, Matthew 24, another healing on the Sabbath. That really seemed to put them in pretzel knots. They couldn't quite figure out how that worked. It just shut the whole machinery down there for them. But even if your Bible's open, you can look at John 8:48 and 52. He says, you got a demon. You got a demon. You're demon possessed. It's the idea that they did have a statement where he was from. They were clearly believed he was demonic in his ability. The problem now is this. They've been able to kind of get away with that before. The problem, as we're going to see, is when you look at the Old Testament, Satan could never falsify giving sight to a blind person. That was only God. That was always God. And we'll look at that in a moment. And so now they're kind of playing their cards close to the vest, so to speak. I think also, by the way, they had just called him a sinner too, so they're kind of implying where his source of ministry is from. But I think also in this particular setting, that it's a more formal inquiry. It's kind of a legal setting. So, lawyers have a way of saying things without saying things, being a little bit more measured in their words. And I think that's probably what they're doing here as well. It's just being a little bit more measured. And part of the reason is, why did they not accept Jesus? Because Jesus didn't go through their standard approval process to get where he was at, to have the following that he had. So they just rejected him. Again, committed to the method, not to the message. Committed to preserving the method, monkey with the message. And this is exactly what we see them do. Now, one of the things that the man is going to say here, it's an interesting word because he's going to say it's a marvelous thing. And sometimes that can be used positively. Sometimes that can be used negatively. But in verses 30 through 33, we read this. The man answered and said to them, why this is a marvelous thing. Notice what he says is marvelous here, that you do not know where he is from, yet he has opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. So again, marvelous is a word. It can mean wonderful. It can mean admirable, but it can also mean something strange or unusual. It can almost have a negative connotation depending on the context it's used in. And I think here he's using it negatively. He says, this is odd, guys. This is really strange. You're acting very unusual. And the thing that he is saying it's marvelous and strange is the simple fact that they don't know where he's from. It's kind of like the idea, sometimes, they'll say this in secular education, we'll say this in seminary too, but sometimes you take a biblical truth and seminarians and theologians study it so long that we say you have to be this smart to be this stupid, right? It's like there's certain truth that is just so obvious to the average person that sometimes theologians like to dance around it and they miss the obvious truth. It happens the same in the intellectual realm. It's like, where does, and not to step on anybody's toes, but like where does evolution find, its footing? Usually in the halls of academia. And again, you have to be that smart to be that stupid sometimes. You miss some of the obvious things going on here. And this is what's going on here. Here is a guy who's just an average guy. In fact, he's never even seen a scroll of the Torah in his entire life. Every biblical truth that he's ever taken in, it had to have been read to him or shared with him by somebody else. And even he knows that there's something strange going on, how they can't identify a guy who opened the eyes of the blind when that is a divine, undeniable miracle. And the guy's like, what is your problem? Y'all are the religious leaders. You should know these kind of things. And so he's insinuating, you should have known who Jesus was. This is not a complex puzzle. You guys are acting like this is a 1,500-piece puzzle. And it's like, no, it's literally kangaroos and giraffes on a puzzle. I mean, this is simple, easy baby problems. And they're just making it complicated. He says, this is strange that you guys are acting. This is so unusual that you guys are acting this way. And notice where he goes again. You guys are acting like you don't know, and yet he opened my eyes. It's almost like, do you guys understand the significance of this man opening my eyes? Do you understand that? He's just blown away. And so even though they can't identify Jesus, they're not confident about who he is, he has really done something remarkable. And to this man, he said, what more evidence do you need that this guy is from a divine origin? And now I think what he does here in the next verse or so is he just presents his argument. This is a logical argument that anybody with any amount of reasoning power could follow. And this is what he's going to say. And typically when you're making an argument, don't you start with something that people can agree on? And this is exactly what he does. He says, now we know, we being who? Me, you, everybody else. We all know this is kind of the idea. And we know this intuitively, instinctively. What he's about to say, we know intuitively and instinctively. We know this, that God doesn't hear sinners. Now, does that mean that God can't hear? Does that mean God shuts his ears? No, what it means is he doesn't hear with the ear of the mind. Okay, it's not just that he loses his hearing when a sinner tries to talk to him. It's that he doesn't engage with the sinner. It's kind of the idea. I would say that he doesn't work with sinners. Okay, maybe that's even a more practical way of saying this. God doesn't hear sinners. We all know this. God doesn't work with sinful people. We all know this. God doesn't need to get to his end by using sinful means. God never does it that way. It's kind of the idea of what the guy's saying. But you know what else we know? If anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. And so in contrast to a sinner or somebody who does the opposite of this, doesn't worship God, doesn't do things according to his will, he doesn't hear them. But here are the two responses given. First response, if someone is a worshiper of God, literally it means someone who's God-fearing, someone who is devoutly leans toward the Lord. It's maybe kind of the idea of what this is communicating. And the blind man is simply describing someone who lives their life in consideration of God. This is something that each one of us can do in our day. That as we go to speak, we take God into consideration. As we go to prioritize our time and things that we're going to do, we take God into consideration. As we think about things, we take God into consideration. That's all. It's real simple. This is God-fearing. This is as if Jesus was tied to your hip as you went about your day. And I guarantee if that happened, we would not be just like, well, I'm going to do whatever I want today and I'll just get to that tomorrow. We'd be like, every step of the way, Jesus, I'm thinking about going over here. Does that sound like a good plan to you? We would just take him into consideration. This is how we're designed to live the Christian life. This is what the man's saying, a God-fearer, someone who's taking God into consideration. God hears this person. He engages with this person. He partners with this person. Second response, he does his will. Somebody's interested in simply doing what God is interested in having them do. Now, what the man doesn't probably realize is he's just described Jesus Christ to a T. This is Jesus. This is exactly how Jesus lived his life, in consideration of the Father, only desiring to do his will. In fact, you remember what he said back in John 4? He said, my food, the very thing I live for, is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish my work? No, to finish his work. In fact, how many times do we, and we've said this before, but how many times do we get our schedule out, and this is what I'm going to do today, and this is what I need to finish today, and we just get it back. It's not that you can't make plans, but when God begins to direct your steps, you just kind of throw the agenda away and be like, okay, I guess that's what I'm doing today. Because we take into consideration what God wants and we consider his will and we want to follow through on what God wants us to do. And as we've said before, God's got good works he's designed us to work in. We don't want to do anything outside of those good works on the day, even if it looks good to everybody else. Who gives a rip about that, right? We want to walk in the good works he's designed us to. Nothing more, nothing less. That's the attitude. And this is what the blind man says. Everyone knows this. We know God doesn't partner with sinners. We know God partners with these types of people. And oh, by the way, let me make my argument now. Let me tell you why I think Jesus fits the latter category here. And he says this, since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. This is, and what he's saying is this is an incredible, undisputed statement of fact. And you know why no one could dispute this fact? Because there was nowhere to be found to contradict what this man said. In fact, I want you to notice just a couple of things about a couple of these Old Testament verses here on blindness. Psalm 146, 8a, the Lord opens the eyes of the blind. Now, notice the word Lord is all caps. And what does that tell us when we're reading our Old Testament? When the Bible translators translate the Lord with all caps, it's translating the word Yahweh. It's translating the word Jehovah. And what this is saying is that there's only one person who opens the eyes of the blind. That's Yahweh. Yahweh owns that ability. But notice this too, as we get to Isaiah 35, and we could go through a lot more verses in the Old Testament. But notice it says in verse 5 of Isaiah 35, then the eyes of the blind, notice that tense, it's future tense, shall be opened in the future. Now, if we had time to develop the context of Isaiah 35, we'd see it's in a messianic context. It's a prediction of what would happen when the Messiah was on the scene in that day. And what it tells us is this. This is what's so amazing. Do you know that there's no recorded stories in the Old Testament about people regaining their sight? You can Google it. That's what I did. No, you can Google it and verify that. There's no stories in the Old Testament of someone regaining their sight. This was a messianic deal. This wasn't a run-of-the-mill miracle, so to speak, although all miracles are miracles. This here, as we get into the sixth hand-selected sign that John chooses, was designed to be an ace card slapped on the table to say, Jesus is the man. Jesus is the Messiah. Has to be. And you can see how they're handling this miracle. It was designed to be so convincing. In fact, Jesus had been healing many blind people throughout his life, just like the Messiah was predicted that he would. You can see those instances there. But guess what? When we see Jesus leaves the scene, there's no example of an apostle giving somebody eyesight. So you don't have it before, you don't have it after. You've got it right there in the time where the Messiah is presenting himself to the nation to be their king. It was prophesied about, and they rejected him. It's terrible. It's heartbreaking, actually, when you think about it. And by the way, there's absolutely no recorded event anywhere, biblical or secular history, of someone being born blind and then receiving sight. And because of this undeniable fact, this is kind of where he makes his point. He's going to go on to say what he does in verse 33. So you can follow his logic. This is what we know. This is what happened, and this has never happened before. And then he's going to say, basically, therefore, let me give you my conclusion. And what he's going to say is this: if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. So what did he just say by stating it in a conditional way? He said, Jesus is from God. You guys don't know where he is from? I'm going to tell you where he's from because of this argumentation, this line of thinking. And the phrase were, it's imperfect. It emphasizes a continual aspect of this in the past, that he has been with God. He came from God. He's been with God is kind of the idea. By the way, it's the exact same conclusion that Nicodemus came to in John chapter 3. I believe if you go back to John 9:16, I believe Nicodemus was probably of the second group who said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? Because this is what he said earlier, John 3:1. There was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. This man came to Jesus by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God. How do you know that, Nicodemus? How are you convinced that Jesus is a teacher come from God? Notice that next word, for. He's explaining why now. For no one can do these signs that you do unless what? God is with him. What did this man just say? If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. It's the same mindset. This incredible miracle designed to prove and validate the identity of Jesus Christ. It's also interesting. I like what the blind man does here. He uses, now whether this is intentional or not, I don't know. I can't say that for certain. But he does use a Greek preposition here. He uses a different one than Nicodemus did. It's para. It means, a lot of times just the general definition is to come alongside of. Okay, para means to come alongside of. It's translated from here. Okay, if this man were not from God. But the Greek preposition means near, nearby. It expresses the notion of immediate vicinity or proximity. I think the idea that he's communicating here is there's a relational intimacy between this man, Jesus, and Yahweh. That Jesus is close to him and that Jesus has always been close to him. So he is totally contradicting and blowing out of the water their evaluation of Jesus as being someone who's simply a sinner or doing things by the power of Satan. He's saying the exact opposite. No, I think you're missing something. I think he's as close to God the Father that you can be. And I think that's what he's communicating here. And he's saying if he weren't, he couldn't even do anything. He clearly couldn't heal because that comes from Yahweh. And so he must be working on the same team. Well, the religious leaders are not going to like that response, as you can imagine. And so in verse 34, as I have said before, but legal advice 101 is when the law is on your side, pound the law. When the facts are on your side, pound the facts. And when neither are on your side, pound your opponent, right? And that's kind of legal advice. And that's exactly what they're going to do here. They don't have the facts on their side. They don't really have the law on their side. So what are they going to do? They're going to come after this man. And that's what we see in verse 34. They answered and said to him, you were completely born in sins. And are you teaching us? And they cast him out. By the way, that comment there shows us the reason the disciples asked the question they did all the way back in verse 2. Who sinned, Rabbi? This man or his parents that he was born blind? See, they tied physical infirmity to a specific sin of somebody. And this is why you can see now the Pharisees bringing that out. This is what they taught the people. And this is what they're now saying. Clearly, if he was born blind, you're just a dirty, rotten sinner. I mean, that's just, you couldn't be born blind unless you were a dirty, rotten sinner or your parents were, is kind of the idea. In fact, he uses this word completely. You're not just a little sinner. You are a big-time, rotten, stinking, dirty, snot-slinging sinner, right? I mean, you're just like, oh, this is huge, right? He's completely in it, a complete unit. And so it's a very critical thing to say. They're coming after him personally. This might have been how they reviled him earlier. We just didn't have it recorded then. Might have been similar. The idea is you were born in sin to the very max that you could be born into sin. And so again, two culprits, as the disciples brought out in verse 2, would have been the parents or the child in utero. And we've talked about that too, that some Jews even believe that if a baby kicked too hard in their mother's womb or punched too hard, that they might be born blind as a punishment to their sin of beating up their mom in the womb. So that was kind of the idea of how a child could be held accountable. And so it's just due to a misapplication of Exodus 20, verse 5, which talks about the sins or the iniquity of the fathers being visited to the third and fourth generations, which really, when you look at the context, had to do with the corporate discipline of the nation, not just individual sins. Oh, your great grandfather rejected me, so I'm going to make you blind. That wasn't the connection at all communicated in the Mosaic law. And so again, it was false because it taught that every bad effect or every kind of occurrence in someone's life that was negative happened because there was some identifiable sinful cause out in the past, somewhere that they could tie it to. And this is what they were always trying to do. And we know that much of the disease, sickness, pain in the world is simply due to the world that we live in. Sometimes it involves, it's a consequence of a choice. That's true. But oftentimes it's not. It's just the result of the world that we live in that's fallen, that obviously Jesus will make right one day. And so let's kind of close out verse 34 because they ask him this question and then they have a response. They said, basically, who do you think you are? You're teaching us? Did you see all the letters next to my name? You're going to teach me about things that I already know, that I teach everybody else, is kind of the idea. And they're accusing him, even though he's just communicating for the first time what he actually believes. Haven't they been asking him what he believes? Haven't they been asking him who he thinks Jesus is? He's been dancing. He hasn't been trying to say. Finally, he's like, all right, look, I'm just going to tell you who I think he is. This is my reasoning for it. And then as soon as they do it, oh, you dirty, rotten sinner, who are you? Who do you think you are? Just get out of here, basically, is their response. And so they were obviously offended that someone considered a sinner could teach them anything. That was kind of their attitude. And so they cast him out. Now, there's a couple of takes on this, and I could be convinced of either one. I kind of take the second one, but some people say that they cast him out, meaning they put him out of where they were interrogating him. So maybe he was in the Sanhedrin. They cast him out of the Sanhedrin, cast him out of that building that they're interrogating him. I believe it could even be further because we saw what they feared back in verse 22, that they would put out, if anyone confessed that Jesus was the Christ, they would actually put him out of the synagogue. So I believe it's possible they excommunicated him here, that they put him out of the synagogue, which would have been, as we said last week, a huge deal. But not as huge to a blind person because he's never enjoyed Jewish social life. He's never enjoyed economic success. And so it's like, okay, we're going to punish somebody that never really knew what he's missing in the first place. Okay, so they put him out. It's probably that. I would venture to say that they were so mad that, this is the same group that tried to stone Jesus just the day before and at the end of chapter 8. So they're capable of anything, right? They're capable of this anger. So I believe they probably put him out. But I love what Harry Ironside said. Harry Ironside, great Bible teacher of yesteryear, has some really well-worded things, kind of like Wearsby, just kind of every once in a while, they've got just something they say is just worded so perfectly that you just have to repeat it. You can't improve on it. And I love what Harry Ironside said. He said about this man that this was the greatest thing that could have ever happened to him. And he said, do you know why? Because if you look in the next section, starting in verse 45, they cast him right out into the arms of Jesus. And that is just precious to think about. Because Jesus hasn't been on the scene since the healing. And now guess what? Jesus hears that he's cast out, and guess what Jesus is going to do? He's going to go track him down. He's going to go track him down like a good shepherd, which, oh, by the way, what does chapter 10 start with? He's a good shepherd. That's what he does. He finds his sheep. And so let's close there with a word of prayer, and we'll pick up there next time. Lord, I do just rejoice in the good shepherd. I just rejoice in Jesus Christ, and we just desire to see him exalted. Lord, I just pray if anything comes out of this morning, this time that we've spent together in your word, that you would just take the group of people in this room, those listening online, and just give us a more highly exalted view of Jesus Christ than when we walked in this morning. And that we would just kind of maintain that level of thinking and occupation with him. He is definitely one worthy to be occupied with and worthy to be praised. And so we're just so grateful for the opportunity to do that. And it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.